Ritual 5, and every 4 weeks we shift to a different facet. And so we're going to let go of the facet that we had been working on for a month and take a different facet. It's the same jewel that we are cutting, but we are now on a different facet. I try to give titles which are indicative of the character of the particular facet to the initial presentation, the initial lecture, so that the first, the fifth, and the ninth lecture titles will be cues as to the character of the month's work. For instance, the first lecture in Ritual was entitled The Pattern in the Rhythm, which meant that in the rhythm of energy, in the way in which spirit courses rhythmically through life, there is a pattern, and ritual, good ritual, the bones of a viable tradition, which are a good ritual comportment, select judiciously and arrange the pattern so that it is like a finger on the pulse. Good ritual allows you to feel the energies of life. And one of the functions of a tradition is to assure those men and women that they are indeed alive because they have their finger on the pulse of the rhythm of existence by the pattern that they are using. So, the pattern in the rhythm. This lecture is entitled No More or Not Enough Explosions. There was once in the 20th century, a long time ago, a famous writer who submitted to a very old friend a beautiful story, one of the most captivating of all the stories of that particular century, and the only reply was not enough explosions. The entire element of differential consciousness, the vision, the art, the history, the science, none of that was seen. Everything was reduced to a ritual comment, not enough explosions. This particular facet, these 4 presentations, these 4 Saturdays coming up, this Saturday and the next 3, these 4 are the second group of 4 within 3 groups of 4. And each one of our 3-month seasons, our 3-month excursions, our development, has 3 different facets to it. It's rather simple that the 3, in terms of a development, are characterized as beginning, middle, and end. And it's interesting that the storyline of beginning, middle, and end is also reflected in the ancient Greek Aristotelian logic, where one has a development based upon a premise, and one then has a conclusion. And this form, this 1, 2, 3 form, carries all the way through into the 20th century. The difference with consciousness, with differential consciousness, is that instead of simply being able to count ABC, 1, 2, 3, differential consciousness knows enough to put an ellipsis and end the sequencing with an infinity, so that the counting, the sequence, is both cardinal and ordinal in openness. For instance, one of the great books of the early popularizing of astronomy and Physics was by George Gamow, entitled 1, 2, 3, Infinity, with an ellipsis in between 3 and infinity. So that differential consciousness understands that there's not simply the beginning, middle, and end, but that any beginning, middle, and end is within a context which is boundless. This requires consciousness, and that consciousness transforms a universe into a cosmos. The ancient Greek word cosmos not only signifies an order, but it signifies an order which has been reinstated. The Greek term cosmos presupposes a previous stage of chaos, and further, a previous stage of a past cosmos, which in its disintegration had become a chaos, which is now regrouped and reformed as a new cosmos, which will decay and become a new chaos. And so this alternation between chaos and cosmos, extremely poignant. Why should such a rhythm of chaos and cosmos be the ritual comportment of the classical Greeks? And thus from the classical Greeks to the Romans, and via the Romans to European civilization in general. And because of the spread of European civilization in the last 400 years, almost to the total population of this planet. The rhythm between chaos and cosmos is poignantly first recognized in Greek tragedy. And almost like a doctor of civilization, the originator of Greek tragedy, Aeschylus, refuses to critically reflect the tremendous tragic drama which occurs in his particular age. He always uses, in Aeschylean tragic drama, there's always a deep mythic root, so that the tragic realization is on the largest scale of mythic context. And when Greek tragedy becomes refined enough, the very next figure in the development of Greek tragedy, Sophocles becomes so refined that he keeps an absolute equanimity, so that the body of Sophocles works. When one goes through it, one doesn't get the dramatic crags of insight of Aeschylus so much as the vast, infinite harmonies of resonance that characterize the Sophoclean world. It is the third great Greek tragedy in Euripides who becomes the recursive critic who recognizes that the true tragedy is not the Greek tragedy being performed in the theater of Dionysus in Athens, but is happening in the character of the people of Athens as a civilization. And each Euripidean tragedy is a shard of a mirror held up to the audience saying, "You are they. Weep not dramatic tears for a stage production. Your anguish is what is real here." And in Euripides' body of work, the very last Greek tragedy that he wrote, the Bacchae, is one of the books that we're using for this new facet of ritual. The first 4 lectures in ritual concerned the beginnings of ritual, and we used 2 American Indian texts. We used the book about the sacred pipe by Black Elk, and we use Gladys Reichardt's book on Navajo sand paintings. These two books gave us the beginning of ritual. Now we come to the development of ritual, the middle. And we're using Euripides' Bacchae, and we're using the historical Buddha's Mindfulness Sutra. And we will end the conclusion of ritual with a third pair. And for this third pair, I reached out to find the farthest extents towards which ritual can go in its refinement without crossing over actively into myth. Because ritual flowers into myth so easily. And I wanted to have a plant which was still all stem and had not yet flowered. And so it's difficult to find in the world something which is pure ritual in its fullest without having yet stepped over into the blossoming of myth. And for those two selections, I use Basho, the great Zen poet of Japan, the originator of the haiku form of writing. A haiku has no mythic elements in it whatsoever. A haiku is purely ritual, and the ritual use of language in haiku is to such a purified, refined extent that literally one can comport in an existential way to a haiku without any feeling tones whatsoever. And along with Basho, to try and find something which opens so easily into myth that it's almost impossible to catch one's further response, I decided to use a book by a woman named Jessie L. Weston. It's called From Ritual to Romance, and she traces how ancient Near Eastern ritual comportment finally came through a pagan and Christian and esoteric development and became Arthurian romance. But Jessie L. Weston's book is extraordinarily disciplined. She in no way allows her book, to become mythic. She defends against letting the reader slide, however imperceptibly, into a mythic understanding of the material. She presents it with precision so that one can see that this ritual development has an unchanging hard nut core, so that the romances, instead of being edifyingly pretty, are appallingly horrible if not watched with great critical discipline. Jessie L. Weston teased herself on Wagnerian opera, and she, writing a book about the myths of Wagner's Ring cycle and other operatic dramas, became accustomed to being swept off her emotional feet by Wagnerian music, swept off her feet by Wagnerian mythos, and resented enough being swept off her feet without her permission that she learned to critically look at what has happened to me and was able to write very precise books. And From Ritual to Romance, when it came out at the end of the First World War, was like one of those steely-eyed looks at the most beautiful of all Victorian mythos, the Arthurian legends of Tennyson, but to look at them with the cold, distinct, critical eye of understanding that within this beautiful bouquet of flowers of romance are poisonous juices, and that while we can admire the flowers, we must not eat them. One of the original readers of Jessie L. Weston's book, From Ritual to Romance, was T.S. Eliot, and immediately, under the encouragement of his friends Yeats and Pound, Eliot wrote The Wasteland. And The Wasteland, as a great 5-part poem, is a development of the differential consciousness that is first expressed in Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. So we're going to use Basho and Jessie L. Weston as the second pair. But in order to go from American Indian ritual beginnings like Black Elk and Navajo sand paintings through the presentation of Gladys Reichard, in order to go from Navajo and Blackfoot ritual beginnings to Arthurian almost mythos and Basho Zen haiku, we need a bridge. We need a middle. We need a development of ritual which aids us not in developing consciousness as so much as developing a saber-sharp awareness, which is distinct from consciousness. A saber-sharp awareness is a ritual comportment and is distinctly different from consciousness. Consciousness is always differential, but a saber-sharp awareness is integrative. It's integral. Its whole energy comportment is to bring together. So that we're still looking at ritual in the great natural cycle of integration. Nature, ritual, myth, and symbol are a foursome. They're a pattern. They're a pattern of integration, of bringing together. Whereas consciousness does not come into play consciously in integration. Consciousness, when it comes into play, reverses the flow, reverses the energy, reverses the whole energy mode. And instead of integration, one has differentiation. This reversal of flow is characteristic of the development of vision. And the development of vision is a great signal problem. And that problem was addressed by the two works that we have before us today. It was addressed in the Western European sense by Greek tragedy, and it was addressed almost at the same time in the East Asian sense as the Mindfulness Sutra of the Buddha. Not just the Mindfulness Sutra of the Buddha as a phenomenon is the Indian resonance with the Greek tragic development. So that the Buddha is a contemporary of Aeschylus. The ancient saying in Alexandrian scholarship where patterns of mnemonic development were emphasized to make it easier to remember complex stages, said of the three great tragedians that Aeschylus was a seasoned warrior at the Battle of Salamis when the Greeks and Persians fought, Salamis being out from the harbor of Athens, an island about 25 miles out into the waters of the Aegean. Aeschylus fought at Salamis as a soldier. Sophocles was a little boy in the victory chorus of the Greek dance, and Euripides was born on the day of the battle. So that the great three developments, the three stages of Greek tragedy, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, are mnemonically arranged by the old Alexandrian scholarship into a unfoldment pattern. And in a way, one sees the beginning, the middle, and the end of Greek tragedy. For Aeschylus began the form, Sophocles developed it to its ultimate extent, which is a perfect equanimity flowing through the entire corpus of his work. Every Sophoclean tragedy has the most uncanny sense that it ends perfectly balanced. Sophocles used as his structural tuning the Homeric epic of the Iliad. And the Iliad is perfectly balanced. The beginning and the end of the Iliad are a present pair, resonant. As one goes into the epic, one can read back from the end, and you can come to the exact middle of the Iliad, and there a single event is the pivot for the entire paired perspectives and structure, the death of Patroclus. Sophocles used the Homeric Iliad structure of perfect balance to present his development of Greek tragedy, where the Greek word that would characterize Sophoclean tragedy is sophrosne. And it means that kind of equanimity that is perfect. And so the Greek classical sense at its apex loves perfect balance. Whereas Aeschylus is somewhat different. Aeschylus, like Pindar or Pythagoras, loves the precarious crag-like zenith that one can swoop down from and come into balance. The dramatic soaring. And so hidden underneath the Greek sophrosne, the love of the balance, is the Greek need for pinnacle soaring. Whereas Euripides is the perfect Sophoclean balance. Instead of that Greek need for perfect soaring to the zenith, Euripides is aware of a precipitous fall to the nadir, the lowest point. And so while Aeschylus climbs to the pinnacle, Euripides falls to the bottom. And Euripidean drama presents its tragedy in a way perfected in the Bacchae, that the fall to the bottom is not in the drama, but in the audience. And for his temerity, Euripides was always castigated in his time. He almost never won first prize. He was always shunned. And he wrote the Bacchae in exile in his old age because the city fathers refused to have him in the city anymore. And so the old, tired, poignant Euripides, in writing the Bacchae, writes about the most incredible, impossible ritual happening, where the tragedy of the real life is a perfect resonance of the tragic denouement being presented on the stage. That the fullest resonances of what has happened on the stage are to be found in the audience, not just in the audience in their seats in the theater, but the audience in their homes, in their jobs, in their lives, in their families, in their life. And the Bacchae, more than any other play ever written, is a poignant condemnation of the entire civilization in which it has occurred. In his wonderful way of characterizing greatness, Goethe said of Euripides, everyone seems to prefer Aeschylus or Sophocles to him, and yet we read Euripides more than the others combined. We praise the one and read the other. This quality of Euripides makes him particularly poignant. At the beginning of the First World War, in 1913, a book came out, a revolutionary book on Euripides. In 1913, just before the outbreak of World War I, by Gilbert Murray. And Gilbert Murray, I have a little quotation from his book here. He writes about Euripides: "The melody of meaning in his lyrics were lost, and they were lost in his time, and they were lost for centuries, they were lost for millennia, because men had forgotten the pronunciation of 5th century Greek. Because in Euripides' time, the pronunciation shifted and changed." What does that mean? It means that the language no longer had its poetic pattern discernible. The rhythm changed, the pattern changed. The grammar, the syntax, the pronunciation, the meaning changed. No longer could the lyrics be read intelligently. The obviously exciting quality of his plays kept its effect. The plots were still exciting, but there was no one to understand the subtlety of his craftsmanship, the ritual pattern and the way in which it presented existence in a pattern which was necessary for life. The intimate study of character, the skillful forging of links, the clashes between scenes, the mastery of that most wonderful of Greek dramatic instruments, the chorus. Plays had practically ceased to be written, and after Euripides' Bacchae, there are no great Greek tragedies ever again. The next great tragedy beyond Euripides' Bacchae are the first tragedies of Shakespeare, 2,000 years later. There was a great critical book written, I'll bring a copy next week, about Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Shakespeare. Because one can displace Euripides by Shakespeare very easily in the development of tragic insight. Shakespearean tragedy is a great differential development of Euripidean tragedy. In Euripidean tragedy, one has the plummet to the bottom of the valley whose crags are Aeschylean, while Shakespeare drops through the entire earth into open space, into the cold, vast universe that is infinite. And there are moments in Lear where one recognizes that there is a boundless horror awaiting those who fall without wings. To finish the quotation from Euripides, The Age of Euripides by Gilbert Murray. Plays had practically ceased to be written. They were thought of either as rhetorical exercises or as spectacles for the amphitheater. Rhetoric exercises for students, spectacles for the populace. Something similar happened to the whole inward spirit in which he worked, whether you call it philosophy or religion. Meaning became obscured. One of the essential qualities of ritual is to preserve the sharp clarity, the clarity with which one can see form. One has to be able to see the forms within mind clearly. The recovery of the ability to see forms in the mind clearly as a historical epoch was called the Enlightenment. But before one can see forms in the mind clearly, one has to be able to sense those forms in feeling first, clearly. If one's feelings are not clear, one's mind is not going to be clear. And we call that great purification of feeling, where feeling forms became distinct. We call that the Renaissance. But before one can clear the mind or clear the feelings, one has to clear the body. The body itself must be distinguishable on a sharp way. And this sequence, clearing the mind, clearing the feelings, clearing the body, has a fourth part which must be taken into consideration all the time. The fourth part would, in a natural way, be clear about nature. Be accurate about nature. But as we saw, nature refuses to be there, refuses to be tacked down, refuses to be static and stay put. Nature is constantly shifting and seething. And so the fourth clarity is not nature, but beyond the mind. And what's beyond the mind? Beyond the mind is a transcendence, a vision, or if you like, in ancient primitive so-called times, actually primordial is better than primitive, but in primordial times, the visionary, the transcendent, was called magic. One has to be clear about magic. One has to be clear about existence characterized by the body. One has to be clear about language, which holds the forms of feeling. One has to be clear about the mind, wherein ideas and symbols have their objectivity. And one must be clear about magic or vision or consciousness. Now, the classic characterization of these four stages, plus the attentiveness underneath to the nature which has not been talked about as a quintessence, as a fifth essence, is the nature of the Mindfulness Sutra of the Buddha, the Satipatthana Sutra. The Buddha in the Satipatthana Sutra faced a similar epoch to that of the Greek tragedians. Consciousness in India was very close to consciousness in Greece of the same age. The Buddha and Pythagoras are contemporaries. Whereas the Buddha died the same year that Socrates was born. And in a way, Socrates is like the Euripides to the Aeschylus of the Buddha. So that there's a kind of a relationality going on here. The ability for a Socrates to question even himself presumes the ability to see oneself clearly. And the ability to see oneself clearly means that one has to be very clear in a conscious, in a transcendence of nature way. Otherwise, you're still absorbed. You're still absorbed in the body, still absorbed in the feelings, still absorbed in the mind. You must be able to go outside of your body, outside of your feelings, outside of your mind, in order to objectively see the shape. This is a quality which Socrates is able to encourage among his young auditors like Plato, only because there was a generation of genius like Pythagoras or the Buddha, who prepared this transcendent ground clearly. The Buddha, the historical Buddha, in his remembered sayings, and his remembered sayings are usually grouped according to length of discourse, size, number of pages. The very large discourses are called the Digha Nikaya, and they're collected together. There are about 34 of them, 33, 34. The long sayings of the Buddha. And the short sayings of the Buddha are so many and numerous that they're collected by the numbers of stanzas. And they're collected in 3 different collections and groups. All the ones with 7 stanzas are together. All the ones with 10 stanzas are together. All the way down to 1 stanzas. But the middle length sayings of the Buddha, the Majjhima Nikaya, there are exactly 151 of them. There are 15 sets of 10 and 1 set, a 16th set of 1. And one of the reasons for this, you don't find it in the literature because it isn't passed down in Western translations. The reason for this is that in ancient Buddhist Abhidharma thought, a moment of thought of bodhicitta is divided into 16. 8 sections are clearly delineable, and the other 8 always occur as a trill. They never occur separately, they always occur as a group. The intuition of this particular truth of form, of reality, is reflected in Greek tragedy by the chorus. The chorus is always the chorus. There are no individual members to the chorus because this is the trill that's there in the very structure of the way in which thought occurs. So that the use of the chorus consciously in Greek tragedy, like in Euripides' Bacchae, shows extraordinarily high Dharma intelligence. One has to do a double flip to think of Euripides as a bodhisattva, but he really is that on a large scale. So that the 16 parts were always a classic presentation of the whole truth. The high Dharma structure of truth is 16, which is why when you have something like the chariot within which Krishna rides in the Bhagavad Gita, the wheels are always 8 spokes, but there are always 2 wheels, making a total of 16 spokes. So that the chariot of truth rolls, is mobile on a 16-part, but arranged with a pair of 8s. In the way in which the middle-length sayings of the Historica Buddha were arranged, the 16th, the final, has only 1 representative. That set has only 1 member, because the whole nature of the middle-length sayings of the Buddha, the Majjhima Nikaya, its whole nature is to awaken you from being absorbed in the structure, no matter how clear, no matter how perfect it is. You must awaken from that. You must be able to see the clarity, but at arm's length, not mistake it for yourself. And so in order to ensure that, when the middle-length sayings, indeed, when all the sayings of the Buddha were collected into the groups, it was at a place called Rajagriha, which is a mountain in northern India, not too far south of the Ganges River, where the Buddha used to speak many times on Raja is a king, Graha, grasp, the place where the king sits, the mountain where the king sits. In Christian mythos, it would be the great thrones that are on top of Mount Hermon, And when Jesus seeks to show the transcendent reality which he is, he takes a selection of his disciples to the top of Mount Hermon, and he transcends and becomes simply light and shows them the 3 stone thrones. Because from those stone thrones on the top of Mount Hermon, one could look down and see the source of the Jordan River running off past the Sea of Galilee, and on very clear days one can see the Jordan River run almost down to the Dead Sea. The farthest vision that one could see is the ford which goes up to Jericho and goes out now into the desert as far as Amman, Jordan, what is now Jordan. But that's where John the Baptist used to baptize, in that ford of the Jordan. So that from Mount Hermon to the ford of the Jordan River, one sees in one shining vision the entirety of the fertility of what became Israel. The Buddha, when he transcended, they don't say that he died so much as that he transcended. They call it the parinirvana, the beyond nirvana. Nirvana is something that you gain transcendently in life. Parinirvana is a cosmic life, beyond life. So they call the death of the Buddha the parinirvana. And 100 years after the parinirvana, when tradition was beginning to disremember exactly what he said, they gathered together at Rajagraha, and there were still some old monks left alive who were little boys when the Buddha had his parinirvana, and they collected all these sayings together, and they arranged them in the 5 baskets, arranged them by the length. And in the collections, the first 10 sermons in the middle length sayings are the fundamentals, absolute fundamentals, the basic tools by which you make things. And the second set of 10 are called the lion's roar. It's the beginning of awakening. The Satipatthana Sutra, the Mindfulness Sutra, is the 10th. It's the last of the fundamentals, after which one is ready for the lion's roar. Let's take a break. So we come back to where we began this morning. And notice that in this particular education, there's always a movement forward, but the forward movement has within it little tendrils that come back. We've talked about recursive forms in mathematics, but this technique was developed historically by the Buddha. And it's a technique which has since passed into planetary culture and thus into civilization in general. The ancient clarity of mind needed to hear language that was arranged perfectly. That clarity of mind had to be developed from scratch, because in order to hear arranged language takes a practiced hearing. One has to practice hearing, because general colloquial language, the language that takes no practice to hear whatsoever, is in patterns that are current by the little squiggles and wedges that make up what the Buddha called samsara. A language which you can hear immediately is always illusionary. And it never teaches. You never, ever learn something new if you can hear the language first off. You must prepare yourself to hear a better language than you speak in order to learn something other than what you already know, in order not to grind up something new in terms of what you already know, And it's absolutely indispensable to hear something new, something that was never heard before, never said before. And much of what needs to be delivered at this particular venue has never been heard before because it didn't need to be said before. But we have new conditions. We have new challenges. We have new perils in addition to old perils, not to mention ancient perils. And in order to navigate, it's not just between Scylla and Charybdis, but there are dangers for which there are not even names yet. There are terrors too bright yet to even be seen, yet they are there. And so a wisdom education is always in terms of a combed language. 5th century Greek was a combed language. The language of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides is a combed language. It's like a laser light. It's not samsaric. It isn't just happenstance. And we have to prepare our listening for that. And already, in Plato's old age, there were people who could not hear Aeschylus anymore. They couldn't hear the perfect balance of Sophocles anymore. And one of the few tragedians to survive into Roman times was Euripides. Not because of his language, but because of the bombastic way in which Romans presented his plots. And some Euripidean plot structures, when presented with Roman bombast, became comic, or became salon genteel, so that Senecan tragedies of Seneca, are parlor games compared to Euripides. Or some Euripidean plots become Plautian comedies, or comedies like Terence, sitcoms of the Roman public, because the deeper implications, the meanings, are not discoverable in popular language. You have to have a combed language which requires a combed hearing. And to comb hearing requires a purification away from noise, a refinement away from simply sound, to the patient articulation of a refined language. One can almost use the Elizabethan pronunciation, a refined tongue. For without a refined tongue, you would mistake a Scotsman for an Englishman. It's a quality of the flow of language which is able to reach back and hold its ritual comportment, its ritual shapes, so that they are not slovenly covered over by the feeling content of the mythos, nor distorted by the powerful vectors of meaning of symbols. And not made transparent to the point of phantasmal by the powers of consciousness. This takes a very disciplined way of using humanness. And the subject of this disciplined way of using humanness to hear something new was brought to a fine maturity by the historical Buddha. And one of the finest of all of his sutras is the Mindfulness Sutra, the 10th sutra in the Majjhima Nikaya, the Middle Length Sayings, the Satipatthana Sutra. And his technique was to state, are you ready to hear? And if you are ready to hear, can you keep that awareness of you're ready to hear current? Can you keep it present while we speak? And in order to keep it present, one has to have the ability to be aware that an enumeration is happening and that the enumeration is on a certain order, a horizon of linearity, and that there are several, if not many, horizons of linearity. And we're going to spell them out, A, B, C, ellipsis, infinity, on each of several orders, so that when we end up, we have a matrix structure of attentiveness. And this matrix structure of attentiveness is not simply a superior ordering through to infinity, but an arranging of indexing further orders that take powers of infinity. So that attention turns out, on a very mature level, to be capable of infinite infinities. This is the scale on which the historical Buddha taught over 2,500 years ago already. It is not anything new. And so at the beginning of the Satipatthana Sutra, here in the Pali Text Society translation of it, with a little Bodhi tree flower, the blossom of the new leaf, they always begin with the phrase, "Thus have I heard." Thus have I heard. So that you are not given any illusion whatsoever that this is being said to you, but this is being reported to have been heard. You are not being talked to, but you are witnessing the remembrance of what someone has heard. And so the beginning formulaic language, "Thus have I heard," like once upon a time, cues and signals a magic language. The language of the Buddhist Sutras is a magic language. It is a language of supernatural meaning, not of natural meaning. It means it's a language of differential exploration rather than simply and purely a language of integration. One of the differences, one of the taste telltale marks of a differential language is that it can enumerate in reverse order. An integration language always proceeds linearly in a temporal development, never reverses its field. Whereas a differential language, a magic language, is able to reverse its field and count backwards. And a truly mature differential language not only can count frontwards and backwards, but it can turn the entire sequence upside down so it can count frontwards upside down and backwards upside down. So that it has these four basic linearities just to begin with. So that a sutra of the Buddha that begins with, "Thus have I heard," becomes a mnemonic cue to shift to a transcendent differential hearing, because this language is not going to be mythic in any way whatsoever. It's going to be magical. The same way as in fairy tales, once upon a time. Once upon a time is a cue for a magic language. Fairy tales are a magic language. They're in no way to be confused with myth. A myth tells its storyline from beginning through middle to end, whereas a fairy tale can jump around. The structure of a Shakespearean play is never from the beginning through the middle to the end, but always presents the differential grouping together so that when the play is finished, it has explored all of the possibilities that are there in the ordinal powers of meaning as well as in the cardinal development of the storyline. So that when someone tells someone capable of a Shakespearean writing consciousness, not enough explosions, one needs to ask maybe 2 million questions. What about all these other levels at which there are implosions instead of explosions? There are disappearances into vanishing point as well as explosions. And then there are the obverses and the contrapositives of explosions, which serve as insights and as tragic realizations. There are many ways in which one could say, not enough explosions. In the development of Buddhism, there came a time when the language forms were so sophisticated, as in the development of the Vajrayana, the diamond path. In the Vajrayana, a meditative position was the very first word in every sutra, thus. In Tibetan, thus is the word evam, evam. And one could meditate on thus, because in an odd way, the Sanskrit word for thus also is a word which easily means thusness, which easily means, like tathata, existence. And that when you take existence and you turn it inside out, not the reverse of existence, but the contrapositive of existence, existence turned upside down and that reversed, that is called shunyata. That is called the void. And shunyata and tathata are a great diagonal through the logical structure of reality, and they resonate together. No way is the void, is shunyata, the opposite of tathata, of existence. No way. So the great Japanese Zen koan, fullness is emptiness. The koan known as mu. Emptiness is fullness, fullness is emptiness. They are a diagonal rather than a polarity. And only a differential consciousness could see diagonals. The integrative comportment cannot see beyond polarizations. And that's why it's trapped in linearity. And that's why for itself, integration is a lifeline that must be clung to at all costs, even at the sacrifice of life itself. This is why Camus called it suicidal. The existential dilemma. On the personal level, that issue registers philosophically as the problem of suicide. But on the group level, that same existential tragedy registers not as suicide, but as murder. And so Camus, like Basho, able to see quite clearly the issues at stake, very differential consciousness, Albert Camus, wrote The Myth of Sisyphus for the problem of suicide, but wrote The Rebel for the problem of murder. And the problem of society in our time is a problem of murder gone wild because of cowardice of suicides. The problem occurs periodically in developments. It happened in Euripides' day. And the Bacchae is a registry, a shout of anguish that the problems are not seen at all, much less being dealt with. The center of the problem of the Greek tragedy of the Bacchae is with the god, with Bacchus, also known as Dionysus. And Greek tragedies as a whole were presented in the theater of Dionysus. It's not just a paradox. It is a crunch of cosmic proportions. And when we look at the Bacchae closer next week and the following week and the fourth week, we'll see increasingly how the very nature and structure of Greek tragedy, paired with the very nature and structure of Buddhist sutras, holds hands together in such a way that we can understand language as a ritual comportment necessary to existence, but that if it prematurely is let loose into feeling-toned qualities, the myths run away with us. And instead of having a chance later on to become storytellers, we become wrapped up in the story that gets us most. And a myth, instead of being a lifeline into transcendence, becomes a hook that catches us and will not let us go. I once did a symbolic illustration for the story of Job, and I made the capital J of Job into a fishhook. It's the Jonah version of Job. Here's how the Buddha, about the same time as Pythagoras used silences to articulate language so that hearing could be prepared for something new. The Buddha used these recursive repetitions so that constantly as the sutra develops, it periodically goes back to the beginning and restates exactly what you have heard already, except it adds one new element. And then goes back and restates everything exactly, including that new element restated exactly, and then adds one new element. Now, there was a mathematical genius named Gauss in the 19th century who developed this kind of technique, and eventually it leads to late 20th century developments of algorithmic learning. 2,500 years ago, it was pioneered by Siddhartha Gautama in India. And the Satipatthana Sutra, more than any other sutra of the Buddha, meticulously and patiently demonstrates, tells us by demonstration how it is that ritual is able to take one more step, a single step into the unknown. And because if you took 2 steps into the unknown, you may know the first step, but you wouldn't know the second step at all. Because 2 steps into the unknown at once is too much for ritual awareness. It loses its orientation immediately. Ritual, linear comportment can take 1 step into the unknown at a time, and that's it. Whereas differential consciousness has wings, it can fly, it can take 5,000 trillion steps into the unknown in any sequence. So that differential consciousness indexes integration to a level that's asymptotic. But what the historical Buddha was dealing with were people who were used to ox carts, not algorithmic computer spaceships. And so he didn't talk highfalutin very much. He talked basic, Here's this, here's this, here's this. Here's A, here's B, here's C. Here's A, here's B, here's C, here's D. Here's A, here's B, here's C, here's D. Here's A, here's B, here's C, here's D, here's E. Building one step at a time so that the movement was a linear integration which proceeded into the unknown. And the unknown in the case of existence is always the realm of feeling. For the body, feeling is an unknown context. And for the body to have the courage of life to proceed into feeling, it has to feel its way one step at a time. Like in the wonderful fairy tale movie, What About Bob? With Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss. And the psychiatrist wrote the little book called Baby Steps. And Bill Murray learns and figures out his own salvation with diligence, just like the Buddha said. Because if you do just one step at a time, anyone, even a terminal neurotic, can handle one step, a baby step. As the film What About Bob shows, Bob finally becomes the psychiatrist himself and applies death therapy to Richard Dreyfuss, who goes crazy, of course. Why? Because reciprocity is the basic ritual form. And anyone who can cure knows that the real cure, not the adjustment, but the cure of the patient requires for the patient to take the therapist's health and for the therapist to take the patient's disease. There's one thing a neurotic does not understand when they ask for help is they're asking someone to take their crap, to assume their problem. And this is why medicine men were always feared, because they were filled with the problems that they had absorbed. These little weekend excursions of learning to be a shaman are a joke, because a real shaman is radioactive from the first time they face madness. But it's that they're differential enough to have more levels to fill than the madness can stuff. And so a fine differential consciousness simply makes infinitely more levels and more orders. While those lower levels are all radioactive, they're all filled with madness and death. And you want to cluster for a weekend to go and get into this game? Whoa, they say in the valley. Whoa! It's a sign of great ignorance of the age. And that's just for openers. There are problems far beyond that. When one looks at the Satipatthana Sutra, it begins, thus, evam, tathata, thus have I heard. At one time, the Lord was staying among the Kuru people in a township of the Kurus called Kama Sadama. While he was there, the Lord addressed the monks, saying, "Monks, revered one," these monks answered the Lord in assent. The Lord spoke thus, "There is this one way, monks, for the purification of beings, for the overcoming of sorrows and griefs, for the going down of sufferings and miseries, for winning the right path, for realizing nirvana." That is to say, the four applications of mindfulness. What are the four? And then the Buddha goes into this ritual language. It turns out to be in its larger, mature form. When it flowers, it turns out to be mythic language. But the Buddha purposely keeps cropping it cropping his language before it blossoms into myth, before feeling responses and resonance to words and sentences and paragraphs can happen, he snips them in the bud so that there's only stems and leaves, no flowers. No flowers of feeling, only the objective ritual comportment of the words and their sentences and their paragraphs, constantly tending to want to burst into feeling, constantly nipped in the bud. And as the Buddha goes along, patiently, with diligence, doing this, he is presenting repetition, ritual repetition, in such a way that only one new step occurs in a pacing which allows that new step to occur only once in a set. So that the longer that the linearity goes on, and each new stage, each new step is added, the repetition grows by that special increment. And as you hear it, the hearing becomes conditioned. And as the hearing becomes conditioned, the Buddha has a new problem that surfaces. The effectiveness of the method could be anesthetizing to the hearer. You could just become hypnotically engrossed, which would negate all of the development that is seeking to happen. And so the Buddha has to handle not only the increment one step at a time, but he has to elicit the juices of awareness, the sense of context. And so he shows us that while each new step is added, there is another cycle where another new step is the initiation of a higher order. And that while there are steps along this order, occasionally there are a different kind of steps that move to a higher order. And then there are steps along that order. And after a while, another order steps along that and higher, building thus a matrix. So that before he gets to the 4 applications of mindfulness, notice that a ritual, integrative language always is numbering. Numerical designation is not so much a sign of differential language. Cardinal numerical designation is a sign of an integrative language. Myth counts. Myth counts in an arithmetical way, whereas magical languages work in higher mathematical function ways. One doesn't deal with counting, one deals with dimensions of powers, including the imaginative, the unreal, the impossible. A mathematics which does not have imaginative, irrational numbers is a very limited math. So that in a magical language, the ordinal powering becomes as important, if not more important, than the cardinal sequencing. Whereas in a mythic language, the cardinal sequencing is always paramount. It's what you pay attention to. So the Buddha teaching on an integrative way always is enumerating. But there are not just 4 applications of mindfulness. One can't get to those 4 applications of mindfulness until one has gone through the 4 Noble Truths, the 7 links in awakening, the 6 internal, external senses, the 5 groups of grasping, the 5 hindrances. So one has to go through all these sets, all these linearities. What are the 5 hindrances? What are the 5 groupings? What are the 6? What are the 7? What are the 4? What are the 4? But before you can get to those, before you can get to the exploration of all those numerical linearities, a foundation has to be laid, and the foundation must be the actual reality of the way in which distributive ordering happens in an integration way. Regardless of how many levels of cake there are, there has to be a plate that holds the cake. And the plate that holds the cake is an integration sequence that the Buddha enumerates first to the monks. He says to the monks, "Herein, monks, a monk fares along, contemplating the body in the body, ardent, clearly conscious of it, mindful of it, so as to control the covetousness and dejection in the world." Notice that always in every sutra that delineates this particular process, he's always recognizing for us, always cognizing, always aware that when you look at a numerical linear development from a tendency to look at it from the outside, the world immediately has a tone of dejection and covetousness. Covetousness of hugging it to you because you want it, and dejection because it's overpowering and you don't want it. Too much yes and too much no at the same time. Covetousness and dejection. So that the world in its actual nature always affects a being in this paired double way. It's always covetousness and it's always dejected. And that's just a part of it. So that the more that one is ardent, clearly aware, the more that it occurs to you, the flavors of covetousness and dejection occur to you, that they're there. Because the habitual insulation that normally passes for awareness tunes out these elements because they're too much. It's way too much yes. It's way too much no. Coveting the body within the body. In other words, the body existentially simply as body. And only after covering that completely is the next stage, the next step, the next element added. And it's talked about in exactly the same way, the same kind of language, about the ardency, about the covetousness and the dejection, about being aware of it, and that is contemplating feelings within feelings, not feelings within the body. Only mindful of the body within the body. And when you shift to feelings, only feelings within feelings. And then the next one is the mind within mind. Not the feelings in the mind. Not the mind in the body. Body within the body, feelings within feelings, mind within mind. Now, when one has this, when one has body, feelings, and mind, one has ritual, myth, and symbol. Now, the natural quality, what's natural, is to try then to be aware of nature. That's what our whole educational first year is all about, is how ritual comes out of nature, how ritual blossoms into myth, and how myth integrates into symbol. And once you've delineated ritual, myth, and symbol, those three, they automatically elicit the taste for being natural within nature. That's the fullness that's there. But if one is natural within nature, because nature is totally absorptive, it's the ultimate context, it would absorb you out of mind within mind, out of feeling within feeling, out of body within body. You would get a mysticism. A mysticism where you were dissolved back into nature. The Buddha is guarding against this happening, and so he says, adds another step beyond mind within mind. He talks about then mental objects within mental objects. Mental objects within mental objects. Not mental objects in the mind. Not mental objects vis-a-vis feeling. Especially not mental objects vis-a-vis body. But mental objects vis-a-vis mental objects. And so the Satipatthana Sutra, you can read it for yourself, I hope you do, patiently goes recursively over this ground and prepares us so that when one finds these four applications of mindfulness, body, feeling, mind, mental object, these four applications of mindfulness are a foundation, and out of this foundation, one finds new orders. The five groups. What are those five groups? As soon as one has added mental objects within mental objects and been able to be clear about that, not mental objects in the mind, but mental objects qua mental objects, the next step is the group of the groups together, the five groups together. And the five groups are characterized, each one of the five is characterized by a term which translates as subjective. Subjective. The subjective desire for sense pleasures. It's very often abbreviated as pleasures. That's not it at all. That's not what the Buddha, very advanced consciousness, is saying. Not about pleasures. Not even about sense pleasures. It's not about sense pleasures. It's about the subjective desire for sense pleasures. Not about desire. The Western world and its peculiar Victorian and anti-Victorian, both together, need to project upon Buddhism this kind of hatred for desire. Ooh, desire is bad. It's got cooties. Desire doesn't have cooties. It has nothing. It's totally natural. What's being talked about here is the subjective taste to glue everything with sense, desire, pleasure. So that whatever you talk turns to gold, Freudian gold, egotistical gold, which at first sounds good and turns out to be a curse, because if everything you touch turns to gold, including your food and your children, you're in a real mess. So he's saying one has to hold at arm's length not desires, not pleasures, not senses, but the subjective taste to glue everything with this. Because if you apply that particular group, just that first one, to mental objects, you glue them with something that is not of mental objects whatsoever, and you confuse categories, and you return to chaos very quickly. Then you're out of the boat of discipline into the maelstrom of the ocean of samsara without a paddle. What are the others? What are the other hindrances? Ill will. ill will subjectively present. That is to say, everything that you do, think, see, touch, is tainted by immediate ill will, habitual ill will. And because this habitual ill will is subjective, it flows without a trace into the subjective taste for desire of sense pleasures, and so they become infected by ill will, and ill will becomes fortified by this subjective taste for the glue sense pleasures. Do you understand? You don't understand? It's like having fingers that are permanently glued and you try to pick up something to eat it and all you eat is glue. You never get any nutrition. Understand? But there are three others. Notice the Buddha's numericality. We talked about in the beginning of ritual how numeracy precedes literacy. The development of counting precedes the ability of language to, in a written form, handle itself. One of the developments of linguistic clarity. There's also restlessness and worry that are subjectively present. Constant restlessness and worry, quite distinct from ill will. But loses the distinction very quickly because the restlessness and worry filter in and taint everything that is ill will, which taints everything that is pleasure, sense, desire, so that desire, instead of being desire, say, for food, or for giving a hug, or for having a breath of air, desire becomes what is called tanha, grasping. Craving. I have to have it, addictive. And so the basis of nature, elements that are quite natural, are turned into pusher's nightmare. And mixed with that, with the ill will, with the desire for sense pleasures, with the restlessness and worry, is sloth and doubt. Permanent taint of doubt. Not just skepticism, but a nihilism. And sloth is always paired with doubt in really accurate delineation on this level. And with sloth and doubt mixing with ill will and with restlessness and worry and the confusion of desire, pleasure with subjective need is the uprising of doubt that had not arisen before. A new kind of doubt, so that everything in the future, everything in any development whatsoever, is new doubt. So everything is compounded like this. Once these 5 hindrances are enumerated by the Buddha in the Satipatthana Sutra, he immediately, instead of going to a 6th hindrance, instead of going further in this way, one doesn't have to go further, he goes to the next order, which are taking the 5 hindrances as a group. And not only are the 5 hindrances a group, but there is a structure to grouping itself. And so the next order are, how many groups are there? There turn out to be 5 groups. Not 5 groups of all these things, but 5 ways in which grouping handles. It's a 2,500-year-old set theory. And once he goes through that, he doesn't add more to the grouping, doesn't discourse on that further, but goes to the next level, which is about sense bases, 6 senses. And on, meticulously, one step at a time, constantly restating, so that the true Satipatthana Sutra, 99% of it is all repetition. You've not only heard it once or twice, but maybe 30 or 40 times. So that one has to train oneself patiently to hear it all over and over again. And the further that you go, the realization that you're going to have to repeat it all completely just to add one element, that you can't go further than just adding one element at a time, but repeat it all, has a tendency to cue in this dejection, this impatience, the worry, the slothfulness, the slovenliness. The only way to carry through this whole program, this kind of discipline, the only way to carry it through is to give your directionality of temporality up to the ongoingness of it. If you keep counting the minutes, how many more minutes before we can get to something new, you're lost. So that the quality that's there in differential consciousness, the insight, the looking ahead, must be, in a disciplined way, not brought into play. Suspended. Yes, you have that capacity for foresight. Don't bring it into play. That's why the Satipatthana Sutra is a ritual sutra and is not a visionary sutra. All of the classic sutras of the Buddha are all in an integration mode. All of the Majjhima Nikaya, all of the Digha Nikaya, all of the thousands of Buddhist sutras that come from the classical Buddha are all integrative. They all belong to the Theravada, the old way. Whereas sutras that belong to the Mahayana are all differential. They have a magical language, but in a differential mode. The Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Diamond Cutter Sutra, the Vajrachedika, the Avasamsaka Sutra, all of the Flower Universe Sutra, the Jewel Matrix Sutra, all of the Mahayana Sutras are different. They open in an ordinal way, which powers them in not only jumps of one more step, but in whole dimensions at a time. So that Mahayana Sutras are distinct, quite distinct, from Theravada Sutras. And the Mindfulness Sutra is a Theravada. It's an old, ancient, basic sutra. It doesn't go into those bodhisattva realm types of discourse. We'll come back next week and look closer at the way in which the Buddha and Euripides are paired together. Keep in mind for yourself that at the origin of this 4 weeks on Euripides and the Buddha, we have the American Indian ritual beginnings with sand paintings and the ritual pipe, the sacred pipe. Try to keep some awareness that these pair of pairs are going to elicit from our educational readiness a third pair, which will be the Zen poetry of Basho and the literary criticism of Arthurian romance from a Mideast ritual level. That somehow, before there was a Merlin, there was a figure very much antecedent to Dionysus and had something to do with the mysteries of life and regeneration. That magic has something to do with nature. One of the ways in which to tell is that a cycle of fullness in the West is always a 4-part cycle, whereas in the East it's always a 5. The 5th part of a cycle in the West was always called the quintessence and was always hidden. It was there, but it was there in the palm of the hand. Whereas in Asia, it was always the full hand with the thumb out. So Western wisdom always has a hidden quintessence which has to be brought out, whereas Asian wisdom always has it all out. One has to simply have the smarts to recognize it. More next week. Thank you.